Welcome back to Pace Immigration, paceimmigration.com, talking with immigration lawyer Michael O'Rourke. Michael, how's it going?
Pretty good, Sean. How are you?
I'm well, thanks. We've got Canada cracking down on student visas over security concerns. It's been in the news a lot in the last couple of weeks, and I thought I'd take a run at you about what's going on in case there are people out there who are applying for student visas or are thinking about it, and they're maybe seeing these headlines too, and maybe they have some questions about where they might end up. So let's take a step back before we get into the specifics of a couple of cases from the papers. I've got here reasons for inadmissibility to Canada. And sure enough, when I went to the website, we talk about inadmissibility all the time, but usually in criminal connotations or misrepresenting yourself at the border. But sure enough, Canada has it top of the list. Number one is security reasons. Talk about that.
Yeah, so there is a whole class of inadmissibility related to espionage, violence, terrorism, organized crime, membership in various groups, like, for instance, Boko Haram or Sendero Luminoso, or wherever. If you can imagine that they are, the groups are contrary to civil order, they're probably on some list maintained by the Canadian government.
Right. And the government, of course, we read the papers. They read more than just the papers. They share information around with other governments, and you end up on these lists. And then what happens to you if you go and apply for something?
Well, you'll probably not get very far. Often we will see on both sides of the border that governments will delay and delay and delay visa applications when there are inadmissibility issues related to security or national security, national interest. And ultimately, they're usually denied after a long processing time. And whenever we've attempted to go in and actually divine the reasons for the denials, we're met with a big, you can't have this, this is classified, or this is not releasable under whatever statute, and we don't know.
Okay, so funny you should mention that, because I have some cases from the papers here. We'll go over a couple of them. Naturally, we don't know all the facts of these cases, but we can make some educated guesses. This is from the Globe and Mail recently. Federal court expands definition of espionage in decision to bar Chinese student from Canada. Federal court judge has concluded that a Chinese engineering student is a potential spy, the emphasis is mine, and cannot enter Canada in a ruling that broadens the definition of espionage and has potentially wide consequences for foreign researchers. The story goes on in a secret 2021 report, not so secret anymore, I guess. In a secret 2021 report obtained by the Globe and Mail, CSIS, which is Canada's Security and Intelligence Service, said Beijing is using Canada as a workaround because some students are barred from the U.S. CSIS also says Beijing is sending some scholarship students, but not necessarily this one, to Canada with the aim of gaining access to critical high tech. The judge agreed with all that and said, sure enough, this Chinese student can't come to Canada. Your remarks.
Well, courts tend to give deference to governments who make these type of statements about an individual or an organization. It's not surprising. It seems like with recent cases coming out of federal court that certain nationalities are more prone to be labeled as either potential spies, but working in potential espionage, whether it's military or commercial. And again, how do you fight back and prove a negative? Like, no, I'm not a spy. Where do you go from there? You could have hundreds of affidavits from your friends and family. You could show the cleanest of clean records. But if the government is going to say that, yes, we think that because you went to X university, or you had this job, or there was some funding by your somewhat hostile government to your education, you could be coerced down the road to give up information that you learn. I mean, it's all conjecture.
Right. In this particular case, if people want to go and look at the story, there is some remote connection to the Chinese military here. But in this next story that we've got, this one from Iran this time, the story is called Iranian Student Denied Permit to Study in Canada to Dispute Security Danger Label. This one is also within the last week. It's from the Canadian Press. We have here, there is no requirement that an individual who is inadmissible to Canada on security grounds be personally involved in acts of violence, the officer's letter read. This is the officer's letter who is denying this student access to Canada to study here. The threat need not be direct. Rather, it may be grounded in distant events that indirectly have a real possibility of harming Canadian security. What's interesting about the inadmissibility under security grounds, you and I talk all the time about the criminal stuff, misrepresenting yourself. And in that case, it's all P's and Q's and proving this and proving that. And they have a record of this that's popped up and now you're in trouble. In this, they're like, yeah, we just don't want you to come in, and they don't really have to prove a thing.
No, they should just call a spade and say, okay, no Iranian students, period.
Right,
no Chinese students. But of course, that would be politically unpalatable for existing interests within Canada. So they're picking them off one by one. But again, there's no real criteria for determining whether these students are going to make it through this gauntlet of an anonymous, especially in this case, an anonymous IRCC officer within a consulate abroad just saying, at one point, whatever you learn might be used in some manner to somehow impact Canadian security. If you can't tell, Sean, I'm a little bit cynical with this, because we cannot act and we cannot help our clients, and we cannot even give advice when we don't know what's stacked up against us.
Right. So let's talk about the rules then after something like this happens. I had some questions for you. I threw them up on the screen here, but I asked you previously, and the answer was pretty clear really quickly. But does being barred from studying in Canada mean that you can't visit Canada? So in other words, okay, I can't study there. I'm not going to go into the lab. I'm not going to see what could be possibly sensitive information. But in a couple of years, can I come back and visit Montreal?
Say it's highly unlikely, because at this point, when you're making your study permit application, you've been determined to be inadmissible on security or espionage grounds. That's not a decision taken lightly, hopefully, but that's going to follow you for the rest of your life.
Okay, so the next one is then, because I know this happens with criminal stuff, because governments and border security, et cetera, share information. You've often told me about the big databases that they have, and a lot of the countries share them. Can something like this affect you from visiting other countries? I noticed in the one story there, which I want to go back to really quickly, they did mention that some students from China have been barred from the U.S., and they used that as, I guess, quasi-evidence that they were making a good decision in barring this student. So, if you get found inadmissible to Canada for security reasons, does that mean the United States is going to be off limits too?
Most likely, because especially the Five Eye countries, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, all share security databases. And usually for these types of immigration systems, when you make a visa application, you have to disclose whether you have been denied a visa, or whether you have been found inadmissible, or whether you've been excluded from a certain country. So, for instance, I know the US DS-160 requests that. The British visa application also requests this information. So you make a study permit and visa application to Canada, you're denied. This will follow you probably for a number of countries.
Now, the appeals process, I wrote here, is there an appeal process? I noticed in the one story with the Chinese student that obviously a decision was made and then it went to federal court and it was a judge that said, forget it. Is that basically the appeal process?
Pretty much.
It goes to a federal court, the judge makes a decision, and there's really no coming back from that.
Yeah, you can request judicial review in Canada of a decision like that. It's discretionary whether the federal court will take up the case, but yeah, that's pretty much it. If the federal court says no, then there's nowhere to go beyond that.
Student visas in the crosshairs right now in Canada, huh?
Yeah,
Like a
yeah,
lot.
and we're seeing that more in the U.S. We're seeing it in Britain as well. It is, again, I think we've talked about this before, but seems like the world is breaking up into hostile blocks, and what we used to know of pretty much freedom of travel, freedom of movement, the ability to easily migrate, the ability to study in other jurisdictions, other countries, that seems to be waning.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Thanks for this, Michael. You can contact Michael O'Rourke, O'Rourke at pacelawfirm.com. Michael, thanks again for this. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks so much, Sean. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.